people start talking in absolutes of good and bad. Again, very few things exist on good and bad. There's always a spectrum of good versus bad. X is going to be the solution to all of your problems. People focus on those things, they miss the bigger picture. I know.
First of all, tell us a bit about yourself, Paul.
So, my name is Dr. Paul Rimmer. I am a performance consultant by trade, by profession, and what this basically means is academically I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. So my undergraduate degree was in sports health, exercise, nutrition. My master's degree was in sports injury and rehabilitation, and I still can't say it. And my PhD was in healthcare sciences, and I'm also now undertaking another postgraduate qualification in sports and exercise nutrition. So sports and exercise nutrition is more what I've kind of fallen into, but also I do believe that the foundation of performance is health. So I do a lot of health related stuff as well, and that's led me to kind of my own private practice where I work with a vast range of clients, from people who want to lose a little bit of weight, people who've had behavioural issues around food, and not an eating disorder specialist, but people who've struggled with a habit formation and stuff like that, which is kind of a very big passion of mine in terms of nutrition. And then all the way up to sort of professional athletes as well, which has led me to my current role, which is working with a professional team where I'm the performance director. So I take care of a lot of their backroom sort of team, making sure that those guys are supported. So the physios have got the right support, strength and conditioning coaches have got the right support. I'm from the northwest of England. I'm from a little place called Ellesmere Port, which is just by Chester. Studied my undergraduate degree in Leeds. I'd like to tell you more interesting stuff about my life, but my life basically entails the work that I do. So, it is my hobby, it is my passion. I like to train myself, I like to watch what I eat most of the time, within reason. So yeah, that's me really, I guess, in a really broad nutshell.
What made you want to specialise in nutrition in particular?
It's an interesting one. When I did my undergraduate degree, it was a heavy nutrition focus. So I had a passion for nutrition there. And then, for a number of different reasons, I ended up going the sports injury and rehabilitation route, which was a large chunk of my PhD was in that area. But it was when I was studying for my PhD that I started doing some educational work, writing content for various fitness sites. Dipped my toe first in that sort of fitness industry world. And I got really interested in nutrition for performance around about then, because I was competing as a bodybuilder at the time. So I got really fascinated with nutrition there, but then when you're in that world, there's a lot of nonsense that's surrounding it. So I got really involved in various online communities and groups where I try and do a little bit of myth busting and stuff like that. And I'd always kind of sort of stick my oar into various conversations, and it became more interesting to me because with everything else to do with sort of training and health and exercise, people tend to kind of be quite diplomatic with the way they talk. So if people have different ideas on training, people can discuss those things in quite a nice way typically. But when it comes to nutrition, a lot of people, when they talk about nutrition, there's almost like this religious sort of zealotry to it. So it was why people hold on to these eating beliefs started to become increasingly interesting to me, despite the fact you present them with evidence to the contrary that maybe that isn't the best way to do things, or isn't the only way to do things necessarily. So I started getting my teeth into those kind of conversations, those debates, those arguments, and then people started to recognise that I knew a little bit about it. Then people asked me to coach them. So I didn't necessarily intend on specialising in nutrition. It's something I kind of became passionate about because I understand the impacts that positive nutrition can have, but I also saw a lot of misinformation about that, and I felt from my professional practice and my personal passion, the place I could have the biggest impact would be in nutrition. So I still dabble in the other stuff, but because I mostly talk about nutrition, because I get recognised for that in content and things, and through my athletes, because that's what they typically use me for, then I guess it's kind of a forced specialism really. But my actual specialism, my academic specialism, is actually in clinical biomechanics. So motion analysis, injuries, things like that.
As someone who is kind of starting out in the fitness world and learning about nutrition, I am constantly confused by what I can and can't eat, what is the right and wrong thing to follow. I know not to do kind of like fad diets and slimming juices and all that kind of stuff, but things like when avocado became a big thing and it's really good for you and healthy, and then it became a bad thing because it's really high in fat. To people like that who find it really quite confusing on what to believe, what would you suggest as a good kind of starting point to kind of know what's right and what's wrong in terms of nutrition?
I'd say there's a few key things to look for. So you've identified some of them there. One of them is that X is going to be the solution to all of your problems, or Y is the greatest food because of whatever reason. If people start talking in absolutes about anything, it usually means that they're wrong. This is the best. No, context matters. If people can discuss things with nuance and context, and they discuss the pros and cons of a specific nutrition strategy, supplement, health food, then that's really positive. If people start talking in absolutes of good and bad, again, very few things exist on good and bad. There's always a spectrum of good versus bad, a spectrum of positive versus negative in terms of how we might make a food choice. So if people, the first thing I would always say for people who are coming into the nutrition world who maybe struggle with that is just be very cautious about, if you think about the things that if someone was telling you in any other facet of life, like this is the best car, this is the best mode of transport, this is the best hang glider, whatever it might be. I don't know where hang glider came from. You know, people will give you their rationale and their reasons behind all of those things, and they can see the strengths, they can see the weaknesses, and they can have a rational debate over it. And the other thing they don't do is then if you question or ask questions around about a specific nutrition approach or a specific thing, is they don't get overly defensive about it, and they can understand evidence to the contrary and accept it, or explain the context and nuance. So I think it is confusion, but I also think there's also a part of our innate part of our brain which wants us to find a simple solution to a complex issue. So nutrition in essence is for weight loss, because let's keep it within the frame of that, because if we go on a tangent, which I will do, it'll be your day. For weight loss, nutrition in principle is really simple. You have to create a caloric deficit. People will talk about hormones and metabolism and all this kind of stuff, and that's fine, it plays a role, but if people focus on those things, they miss the bigger picture. At the end of the day, you need to create a caloric deficit to lose weight. If people say anything other than that, then if you question them enough, so the best way to figure out if someone's talking nonsense to you is to ask questions and just back them into a corner, because it will test the limits of their knowledge. And then very quickly it will just be like, I've heard it from some blog on the internet, not some expert who's an evidence-based practitioner and nutritionist. So I think it's really important to be able to question things and get an answer that isn't defensive. I also think that the simple answer is you've got to create a calorie deficit. It doesn't really matter how you do that. All nutrition approaches do that. Some are easier to adhere to than others, which comes down to a little bit of trial and error. The most difficult thing actually is the adherence element and the behavioural aspects of it as well. So I think we come from a culture of blame culture. So it must be sugar, it must be fat, it must be this, it must be that, it must be the other. When the reality is, actually, it's usually our behaviour is associated with overconsumption. Do we stress eat? Do we have a relationship where we're always out eating and we enjoy eating those tasty foods? We have to identify those behaviours as well. For example, Live Like Louise uses a macro counting approach. I think one thing that I was brought on board for isn't to just be like, yeah, okay, we know it's a calorie deficit, we know macronutrients are important, and micronutrients and nutrient density and all that stuff's really important. But the most important thing actually is to be able to educate you guys on what healthy really is, what balance really is, because people say this notion of balance and they've got no real concept of what it means globally or as an individual, but also to kind of help them identify, actually, look, weight loss is easy, weight maintenance is hard, because unless you're tackling those behaviours and those things. So that question, as I knew it would go off topic. So one thing to bring it back to a kind of a conclusion, I guess, would be, if people start trying to sell you on this one thing being the solution, generally just walk away slowly. Just nod, shake your head, walk away and say, okay, might be a contributing factor to success in weight loss, might be a healthful food, but if people talk in absolutes, then generally just be very cautious of what they say, and then question what they say as well, and make sure you get an answer that you're satisfied with before employing any kind of strategy, as well as checking the obvious stuff like, have they got credentials, have they got client success, long-term client success, not just made someone lose weight in 4 weeks. That's an important one as well.
I've heard for the last couple of years now actually that nutrition is a huge part of kind of a weight loss journey, and that apparently it makes up to about 70%, and correct me on this if I'm wrong, of a weight loss journey, a bigger percentage than working out would be. That being said, would you say that you can live a sort of healthy lifestyle and lose weight and maintain that through just working out and not focusing on nutrition? Is nutrition as important as they say, or will it just really help in your journey, but you can do the same things with exercise and still be just as healthy without following good nutrition?
Okay, so the current body of research suggests that nutrition is more important for weight loss than exercise. And the reason for that is multifactorial. One of them is, it's much easier to create a calorie deficit through reductions of food than it is through exercise. One of the issues a lot of people have is they go to the gym and they automatically think they're going to lose weight. What they actually then do is they will compensate in other activity, so their overall daily expenditure drops. So let's say you go to the gym, you work out, but then you normally walk the dog. Well, you stop walking the dog as far. So therefore they don't get the same calorie deficit as they think they're going to do. We also, for some people, might get compensatory behaviours, so they go to the gym and then they use that as a justification to eat the calories back. That's a really common one. And like I just said, to drop 300 calories from food to put yourself in a calorie deficit is quite easy to do from food if you're clever with what you do. To actually burn 300 calories in the gym, particularly for females with low lean mass, is very, very difficult to actually burn that. And especially if you're trying to use things like activity monitors and you overestimate in how much you're using. So when it comes to weight loss, there's a significant amount, there's a balance of evidence which suggests that caloric restriction through nutrition has a bigger impact on weight loss than just exercise alone. Now, if you can have exercise with nutrition, then you get an additive effect. So I don't like this notion of percentages. I don't know where the 70% comes from, and I'll tell you why I have an issue with that. Because if I have someone who comes to work with me who is, say, quadriplegic, is in a wheelchair, can't be very physically active, well then if they need to lose weight because they're at risk of diabetes, because they're overweight and they can eat for themselves to a certain extent because they can demand food and someone's feeding them, so there's they can gain weight, can become overweight. They're very sedentary, obviously. But nutrition is going to be 100% of their ability to lose weight because they physically can't move. They have their organs, producing, demanding energy, so their rest of metabolic rate still exists, obviously, but their overall movement capacity for exercise to play a role in that is non-existent. Whereas the other end of the spectrum is if you've got someone who decides that for their weight loss journey they're going to take up an Ironman and they start training 20-30 hours a week, then they might not need to think about their nutrition as much because their energy demand is so high that that's the case. Now that wouldn't be typical of someone who wants to lose weight. They wouldn't just go straight into 20-30 hours of Ironman training a week. So what I'll do is I'll focus on the middle ground there, and I'd say in that middle ground, that's where nutrition is more important for weight loss. However, for weight maintenance, exercise plays a massive role, exercise and activity. So one of the key indicators of weight loss, and then the maintenance success, as we will call it, is actually, is exercise is a key role in that as well. So I think nutrition is massively important, and especially dependent on the nature of the person who's coming into that. If it's someone who's got a healthy level of body fat and wants to lose a few pounds, then actually exercise might just be sufficient if they're quite sedentary to do that, if they've got good eating behaviours. If someone's very overweight, then there's a whole lot of nutrition education that needs to be on there. So even if you're not calorie counting, nutrition education is still massively important, and not just nutrition education between what calories are, carbs are, fats, proteins and all that stuff, but actually the behavioural education. Let's take a step back and reflect upon why we eat at certain times, what we eat at certain times. Do we understand that most of weight gain is small incremental increases in calories over your daily needs over long periods of time? Like people focus on Christmas and holidays and things like that. Actually, most weight gain occurs over small increments over time, and that's usually attached to one or two behaviours which can be changed. However, to change those behaviours, you need to have an understanding of those behaviours, and to have an understanding of those behaviours, there has to be typically some logging of food intake. So I don't think you necessarily need to calorie count to lose weight, just to take that question a step further. But I do think if you don't know what the nutritional value of foods are, then logging and tracking food intake is important, but not just for the sake of tracking calories, also to educate yourself on foods, and also to get an idea of, well actually, it's the weekends that are the issue here, and maybe I'm spending too much time drinking or socialising. Maybe it's when I've had a stressful day at work, that's when I come back and destroy an entire packet of jammy Dodgers. From that sort of thing, tracking and calorie counting is only as useful as what you take from it. And if it's simply about creating a calorie deficit, then yes, that will get you the short-term results, but to see it in a bigger picture and use that for sort of long-term maintenance and being able to not have to track forever, I've got my MyFitnessPal is the food login app that most people would use. I'm like an internal MyFitnessPal, partly because it's what I do professionally, but partly because when I competed as a bodybuilder, I wanted to know where every gram of things went. Came from a very different angle, but also was very educational. So now I can kind of eat intuitively, which is, I think, is the aspiration that everyone should try and get to. But to just say people should eat intuitively is problematic, because intuitive eating, if you've got disruption in hunger signals, food cravings, if you're eating intuitively and you're stressed and your intuition is to eat whatever, and I know you should be mindful of what you eat and all that stuff that ties into intuitive eating, but unfortunately with intuitive eating it's great in terms of creating body positivity, it's great in terms of understanding of eating behaviours, but as a weight loss tool, there's not very much evidence to suggest it's very good. So we've always got to balance what we would call dieting versus mindful eating and the behavioural stuff, and it's very different for different people. One of the criticisms of any kind of diet really is that there's a risk of eating disorders, obsession with numbers, and I don't know the answer to that. That's the truth of the matter. So dieting is known to be associated with eating disorders by default. People who have anorexia, or people who have issues with body body confidence, consciousness, will inherently be dieting. So there's an association there. The real question for me will be, does dieting trigger eating disorders? Okay? And that's a much murkier question. The reality is that it's whether it's the cart before the horse. Do people who have body confidence issues then blame the diets for that, or is dieting actually a trigger? I think most of the literature on that at the moment would suggest that actually dieting is a trigger, but it's not the cause. So the trigger's like, if you're pulling the trigger, but there's some other mechanism behind that's actually causing the eating disorder that needs to be addressed. So it's not the diet within itself that's doing it. The second part of that is then, does flexible dieting approach, is that better or worse than, say, any other rigid dietary approach, restrictive dietary approach? And actually there's evidence to suggest that flexible dieting is less likely to cause eating disorders than a rigid approach. And the reason for that is simple, because it's not simple, but it's fairly simple, and it's because rigidity means that we then become worried about eating certain foods, where flexibility allows us to eat pretty much what we want within reason. Okay? So when it's rigid, it creates that anxiety about certain foods, and it's that anxiety that can then lead to eating disorders. So then the other thing is, well, is there a better alternative than flexible dieting that doesn't have any risk of eating disorders? And not to my knowledge. So things like intuitive eating, to bring it back to that, have much lower reported cases of eating disorders from any other type of diet. However, it's not a particularly effective weight loss strategy in my opinion without the other education stuff, and the education stuff needs to come from some form of food login, so it becomes this vicious circle. I think ultimately though, it's to have a little bit of context and to take a step back and say the amount of people who diet who actually develop eating disorders is very, very small. The ones that can say dieting is actually a cause of that is probably even smaller again. So it's something that we have to be aware of, and we have to we try as best as we can in a group situation to monitor as many people as we can. And if people do email us and they are having issues around things, we will tell people, look, don't track your weight. If that's causing you an issue, don't do it. If you're having issues tracking macros, I have clients that have come to me and say that I don't like doing this, there's other strategies you can look at. The other one would be the behavioural stuff, so changing those one or two behaviours. But again, you can't identify the behaviours and how problematic they are until you've tracked and logged your intake, which is why registered dietitians and nutritionists typically will take those bits of information. So I think the one thing I am always cautious of is to use something as a crutch not to do something. So when people say to me, I don't want to do this because it might increase my risk of developing an eating disorder, I can understand why people would be concerned about that. But I would ask that individual, because it's not for me to answer, I wouldn't tell anyone how they should or shouldn't eat. I would ask them, are they using that as an excuse and a barrier to keep continuing the way they're eating, which hasn't worked for them in terms of weight loss, or is it a genuine concern? Because they're two different things. If you've naturally come from a personality who's got an obsessive tendency, you're obsessive about exercise, you've been obsessive about other things, you come from an addictive personality, whether that's gambling or whether it's been anything else which you're obsessive, then maybe counting calories probably isn't for you. But I think for most people, it's not a long-term solution, but it is a starting point for education that, unfortunately, without it, I don't see how we can create success. And if you look at the current obesity epidemic and the implications of that are only going to start to become evident in the next 5 to 10 years. There's a lag between obesity and the health problems this country have. And sometimes we have to say there may be a risk, but actually is it the lesser of two evils? And that's the position I come to it from, taking a step back away from the individual, talking as a societal thing. People do need to be more aware of what they're eating and why. And the easiest way, most effective way to do that is through food tracking and logging. So I think that answers probably the most complex question we were going to discuss today. So hopefully it's something to do a little bit lighter and easier now. Yeah.
No, I completely agree with that. Because before this, I never did any kind of dieting or anything, just because I knew that I wouldn't sustain it anyway. I've got that personality where once I get bored with something or something doesn't work after a week or two, I just give up on it. So it wouldn't have worked for me anyway. But I did start the macros thing, and I did that because I thought, it'll just help me to kind of like track and make sure I don't overindulge in weekends, because I thought that was my problem. What I realised within a week of doing it was that I was actually massively under-eating on my calories and my protein and massively over-eating on my fat. And that's probably what my problem was. And I wasn't getting anywhere near enough protein or the carbs I needed to sustain me through the day. I was just eating so much fat and I didn't even realise it. So through doing that, it didn't stop me like calorie counting or anything like that, but it really helped me to understand the foods I should be eating instead, and actually helped me to realise that I could eat a lot more than I actually was.
In terms of food volume, as long as
I track that fat.
I think that's really important, and I think it's when people latch onto a dietary idea, and it's something that through the Live Like Louise project, something we say to people, like we get it after a week, like I haven't lost any weight yet. It's like, but did you learn anything this week? Like success isn't just about what that number on a scale says. It's about if you've learned something new about nutrition this week, that's a success. And it's from those small successes that we create motivation. That's an important part of motivation, is being able to look at ourselves at the end of the day and say, you know what, I learned something today. And people don't give themselves enough credit for doing the small stuff. They don't give, even if you've not lost any weight for a month, if you now know what protein is and you know what carbohydrates are and you've identified one or two behaviours, that's a huge step forward, because that's the stuff, when you do get it cracked and nailed, that's the stuff that matters in the long run. You're just front loading your education and your ability to be able to then maintain weight. And I think that's one of the frustrating things from interacting on the group sometimes, is that when people who just go, well, I've tracked for a week and I've not lost weight, and it's like, right, that's fine. We say, like, we don't want this to be a long-term solution. This is phase one of give us some information, let's see how it goes. Right, well, what did you learn? What didn't you learn? What's different about that? And none of the content I've done on the group is about I may talk about protein, fats and carbs if there's questions. None of the content I do on there is about calorie counting. It's a tool, it's a vehicle. It's not the ultimate solution though. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of differentiate between. In fact, I actually did a video for my private page which talks around like 5 reasons why flexible dieting sucks, right? And it was done not because it does suck, by the way, but because people use it as this whole solution to all their problems, and it's not. They don't understand nuance, they don't understand context. So they're saying that flexible dieting isn't a fad diet as such. People who just go, flexible dieting is the only way. It's not. It's a good way, and it's an evidence-based way, but it's not the only way. And people who then can't see the flaws or demerits in using that system, then also don't listen to them as well. So I think there's a problem with that. So one of the flaws of using MyFitnessPal, as I'm sure you're aware, is that it's a user-generated app. So if I'm a coach and I just say you need to track your calories, you can't lose weight, well then it's your fault, something's going wrong or you're lying. Well actually, if you don't understand the app and its limitations, then then how does that work? If someone, I had a consultation with someone the other day who was like, I avoid carbohydrates. Now again, fine, but they didn't. Their definition of carbohydrates wasn't one that comes from a point of education. So again, when they have the food tracking, if someone is struggling with something, we will access their diaries and say like, look, can we just have a quick look? Okay, we might have a bigger picture, a bigger idea of what the issues are. So there are issues with it, and the issues are things like it doesn't teach you about behaviours. It's the other stuff, the stuff I talk about, reflective practice, identifying behaviours, working on self-worth, self-value, mindful eating, the more intuitive stuff which might not cause the weight loss, but that's what it's going to feed into for maintenance. That's the important stuff.
I'd like to do a little bit of myth busting.
Okay.
So obviously you've mentioned that you hate when people say things about nutrition which you know not to be true, or you see that people say things online and you're just like, oh, let me just correct you a bit here. And one example was, and you know I'm going to ask this, a few weeks ago, well it might have been a month ago now, on This Morning when there was a nutritionist on saying stuff, and I want you to kind of explain what it was and like what made your reaction, but you really weren't happy with it and you were like, I really don't want people to start believing this and listen to this because I don't agree with it. But yeah, tell me a bit about that.
So I don't tend to try and call people out because
Yeah.
I'm too busy, and I think a lot of people when they talk about nutrition, even if it's not good advice, they come from a place of love and genuinely trying to help people. I think there's very few people who are actually trying to mislead people, almost like the kind of religious thing I was talking about. They believe that their dieting God is the right God and they just want people to share that experience with them. However, this person was a doctor, a person who was a registered dietitian, who was very high up within the establishment. I think was on the board of the British Dietetics Association. And just the advice that she was saying in terms of, you should always train fasted because it's going to lead to more fat loss and things like that as well. The problem with that is that on face value it's partly true. There's some truth in that, but it completely mixes the bigger picture side of things. It's things that you should have, caffeine of a morning and things like that, which is fine. Caffeine will give you more energy, which can help with performance, which can help with weight loss. But even in that case, let's say you had no carbohydrate stores and you start exercising, so fat's your only fuel source, you are going to burn more fat. But unfortunately, the body's clever, and what it will then do over the rest of the day, over a 24-hour period, is you then get reductions in fatty acid oxidation in favour of other fuel sources. So then when you do eat carbs later in the day, then you're going to get that balance shift anyway. So over a 24-hour period, there's negligible differences, and it's just factually wrong. And for someone to be in that position and state that, and particularly if people have got issues with, there's certain medical conditions where people have reactive hypoglycemia. So when they exercise, they get a massive uptake of carbohydrates from the bloodstream, and then they get really faint and lightheaded. Well, then to suggest that to them is just a preposterous thing to do. In certain medical conditions, if certain diabetics and stuff, if they need to be careful with what they're eating in and around their training and things like that. I said at the start of my nutrition career, I was very much in a position of calling people out and trying to change people's minds, and then realised it didn't work, directly conflicting with people.
Yeah.
So actually now I tend to I work more on the education side of things, because then that way it's sort of take it or leave it, it's less confrontational, and that sort of thing as well. So yeah, that triggered me a little bit, I must admit, and I don't get triggered very easily.
No.
Mostly because I do, but I'm just too busy to interact with it really. But I thought that was important in case anyone had seen that.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people did. I saw, like you said, a lot of negative comments on there. So I knew straight away, even if I wasn't very well educated and if what she was saying was true, I could tell by the vast amount of comments on there saying that is absolutely ridiculous, that they can't have been wholeheartedly the absolute truth, which was how it was made out to be. Like a lot of things about nutrition on the internet.
Unfortunately, this is part of the problem. If you follow a specific nutrition strategy, we know how Facebook algorithms work. You only ever really see the news that you're involved in, and it works the same for anything. So, for example, if you search into Google low carb dieting is best for weight loss, for example, all you're going to get is all the positive things that says about that. So what I'd encourage people to do is, if you are searching a diet strategy for anything like that, always search for both sides of that.
Yeah.
So, or criticisms of low carb dieting, positives of low carb dieting. Look at both sides of the argument, make your mind up for yourself.
I quite like to find out things about things that I might eat every day that I think one way about it, but it's actually another. From your kind of journey and your learning and your clients and the people that you've met and the people you talk to on forums and stuff, what are the main big things about nutrition that we haven't covered already that a lot of people believe but aren't actually true or should be thought of in a different kind of way? It could be anything from a certain type of food or a certain way of eating, or people think that something's really good for you, just something that a lot of people...
I've kind of mentioned it in sort of passing, but I think the one that still persists is this notion of carbohydrates. And this notion that insulin, which is a hormone that's released when you ingest carbohydrates, stops fat loss entirely, and then that means that you have to then reduce carbohydrates to lose body fat. I think that's just a persistent one because it sounds quite, the way I've just described that there probably sounds quite scientific. I'm not going to sit here and give you a science lesson, but basically the evidence doesn't suggest that. It doesn't matter where you reduce calories from as long as you create a calorie deficit. Studies to show that, it's been known for a long period of time, but for some reason, because again, it shifts the blame away from that thing. So I think that's one that, although everyone does kind of talk about it in what I would call the evidence-based nutrition community, I think in the general population it's one that people still don't have a grasp of.
Yeah.
And the big area as well, the big area which is now becoming increasingly, I think it's becoming increasingly into focus for trainers and coaches to work with general population clients, but people vastly underestimate the power of habits and behaviours. You know, people say like flexible dieting is an evidence-based nutrition approach. Well, of course it is, because it creates a calorie deficit and uses science to sort of show the best approaches to that, like high protein diet and all that stuff. But actually, you know, when we're working with individuals, and what's taught me is, I used to be very much of a mindset where it was like, well, why can't you just do that? And I think the thing I've learned, here we go, this is it. I've taught myself into this one, this is it. The thing I've learned, and it's something that a guy called Gary Mendoza, who's a behaviour change specialist, said. He's got an amazing course on it, so I'd advise at some point you go on his behaviour change course. It will help you when you get qualifications with clients. He said, you can't treat other people with your own value system. And I think that's true of every relationship I now have. So the assumption that people should do what you do because it's your value system is a straight up barrier for doing things. So for example, in a friendship or a relationship, when people ask you for advice and you impart your value system onto them, actually a lot of the time there's a discrepancy there in your communication channels. So for me, I try not to go into things now with any assumptions about knowledge, any assumptions about that individual, because people will always surprise you. So I think that's the most important thing for me, and something that I think we all have to do, is not straight away go into advice giving mode and critical mode of somebody, but take a step back, walk a mile in their shoes as it were, and really start to understand that actually, you know, that people don't have to think like you, and that's okay. But that doesn't mean that we can't help them. We just have to really be a bit more creative in those solutions.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've pretty much covered everything that I wanted to ask.
Awesome. And I appreciate you taking your time to come down today to sunny-ish London. So yeah, no, I do appreciate it, and I hope anyone watching this has got some value from it as well. And if anyone does up in the Leeds area or northwest of England area or Yorkshire area, basically the north, then look at my business, drop an email, come along, say hi, and cool. Be happy to help where I can.
Right, thank you.